All right.
Got it.
Okay, good morning, and
good morning, Indran. How are you? Lovely to see you.
Likewise.
It's been so long.
It's been a while. Anne Casey is in Sydney, Australia, and I'm recording this from Rockville, Maryland. So evening for me and morning for you. And it's the morning of the poem. It's a celebratory morning for me because we're talking about The Light We Cannot See, your new book, your third book of poetry. And 3, as you know, as we all know, is a lucky number and a celebrated or an optimistic number. So that's good.
Good.
Yeah. 3-act plays.
I'll take what we can get these days.
All right. Yeah, we've got, I'm talking with you at a time in the Earth's history, which is rather complicated, the boiling.
Cataclysmic might be a good word.
Cataclysmic might be a good word. And yet, at this time, there's this new birth, metaphorically, this book. And so tell us about a little bit about The Light We Cannot See. Why the title?
Sure.
Why publishing this book at this time? And I know it's being published by Salmon, which is an Irish press, and you're an Irish poet, but you live in Sydney, so Australia, and have been there for some time. So tell us about the origins of this book and the title.
Sure. So there it is, The Light We Cannot See, and you'll see on the cover it's a ruined palace.
Right.
Yeah, it's a palace in France. It's an abandoned palace, and the picture is by wonderful French photographer called Jerome Gard, who you can find on all the main channels and social media. And I guess this book is kind of the ruined palace of the earth, I wrote an article in the Irish Times recently about the writing of this book, and I said 30 years is a strange place to start when 30 years ago, when talking about a book that's just been published. But that's where this book started. It started 30 years ago when I was a junior, a young journalist in Dublin. And amongst my beats was the environment. And every day coming across my desk were the most shocking stories about every river in Europe was dead. There was, nuclear leaks. There was massive oil spills. There were workers in many industries being poisoned by chemicals. And it was apparent that we were doing great harm to the earth. We knew about chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which were breaking down the ozone layer. We knew a little bit, we were getting, by 1990, we were being told very serious issues about climate change and the warming of the earth. So all of this was coming across my desk, and I was going out into the world and talking to people about this, and I couldn't understand why nobody was talking about it. It was so scary and dramatic to me, and so important. I've continued to have a connection with environment writing the whole way through. I've written a legal book on the environment, environmental law here. I write a lot of eco poetry, which has been used by groups like the Climate Guardians, who blockaded the G20 in Europe, in Paris, and Extinction Rebellion and the World Wildlife Fund and Climate Coalition. So I suppose I've written some climate protest poetry, but a lot of what I write is eco poetry, which really is poetry of the world and of the wild. And it's my observations as a witness to what is going wrong, to all the losses we're sustaining. And that's what prompted this book. That, and there's a poem in here called Night Traps, which is dedicated to my younger son, because I suppose the genesis of this book also is partly from some words he said to me 2 years ago when he was 12. We've always gone out into nature, you know, we bushwalk.
Right.
I bushwalk every day, I bushwalk with my kids a lot. We go to the Great Barrier Reef and we go back to the west coast of Ireland, and through all of those interreactions with nature, it's very apparent there are major changes happening.
You're talking about the poem Out of the Mouths of Babes? Is that?
No, that's one,
that's
but
one.
it's actually the poem Night Traps.
Night Traps,
which,
sorry.
Won the Proverse Prize, International Poetry Prize in the past 6 months or so. And the line in that poem is, "Where will they go, Mum, when all the trees are gone and the reef?" And it's about, because his connection to all the animals. We have the most gorgeous animals and birds who come in our backyard because we back onto a nature reserve, and that's where we go walking. And you know, he knows that part of that reserve is going to be torn down as part of the Premier's plans to build a road tunnel, which there are some other reasons why that may not be such a good thing, but he's also going, but if they tear that down, where are all those animals going to go? And this is something we don't ask ourselves when we're putting, you know, major infrastructure in or whatever. We're so busy using the world for our own purposes. We don't think about the impact of us eradicating wild areas. And
let me hold you there, because it's fascinating. But let's hear you read one of the poems from the book. I mean, perhaps constitutional or the Out of the Mouth Babes or the harvesting. Would you? And then we can keep talking.
There's a poem that you actually very honored me greatly. You published it in Beltway Poetry Quarterly, and you also nominated it for a pushcart, which was really amazing and wonderful to me. Thank you. Either way, the fact remains. And I mean, that really does tell the story of that same destruction. I don't know if you would like that one, or if you'd prefer one of the other ones you mentioned.
No. We can go with Either Way, the Fact Remains. Let's hear that now, and then we'll continue talking. Thank you.
Either way, the fact remains. There is no way back. Therefore, we can no longer hold as irrefutable truth that every human heart has sufficient good at its core, that we could muster the collective will necessary to save our precious planet. There is no denying we are capable of taking the measures necessary for our own survival, to secure the future for us and the almost 9 million species around us. We could make the right choices. The fact remains that Earth cannot repair itself. There is no basis, even from advanced satellite findings, to show that Earth and all who dwell on her can survive the impacts of human activities. The greatest scientific minds of our time attest that the world's largest living structure, the Great Barrier Reef, is on path to certain destruction, that over 2,000 species from sea level to 2,000 meters deep are destined to perish. We can no longer support the assertion that there is always a way. There is a way to undo the damage we have done. Allowing that we make every effort to counter global excesses, the impact of human activities is irreversible. Although we may think that we can take action to fix this, we cannot deny the inevitability that not one of us can make a difference. Nature cannot heal itself. We can no longer lie to ourselves that this devastation can be reversed. Now I'm going to read the whole poem backwards from the bottom up, and I hope you see something magical happen. This devastation can be reversed. We can no longer lie to ourselves that nature cannot heal itself. that not one of us can make a difference. We cannot deny the inevitability that we can take action to fix this. Although we may think the impact of human activities is irreversible, allowing that we make every effort to counter global excesses, there is a way to undo the damage we have done. There is always a way. We can no longer support the assertion that over 2,000 species from sea level to 2,000 meters deep are destined to perish, that the world's largest living structure, the Great Barrier Reef, is on path to certain destruction. The greatest scientific minds of our time attest that Earth and all who dwell on her can survive the impacts of human activities. There is no basis, even from advanced satellite findings, to show that Earth cannot repair itself. The fact remains that we could make the right choices to secure the future for us and the almost 9 million species around us. We are capable of taking the measures necessary for our own survival. There is no denying that we could muster the collective will necessary to save our precious planet. Every human heart has sufficient good at its core. Therefore, we can no longer hold as irrefutable truth that there is no way back.
Really, you take our collective breath away. I speak for all listeners, the whole planet. What a brilliant idea, and execution. I mean, you write this poem down, and then you write it back up. You bring us to feel all of this despair, and then you give us, with the same words, the response, the chant, which is, of course, key to us. We murder and we create at the same time, don't we?
True. But I think, for me, in the end, to be human is to hope.
Yeah.
We have a natural survival instinct that makes us hope. I was going to say to the bitter end. I hope it's not. I hope.
Well, it's good to have that sense of irony, I think, but
yeah, I'm so glad you got that, about that poem.
No,
It is absolutely about, saying how bad it is, but saying, it's in our hands.
Right.
We still have the opportunity to change this. It's in everyone's hands, and it's about the small things, it's about making small choices.
Right.
Like, 30 years ago, when I was in this situation, seeing all this stuff, I read this one book called Diet for a Small Planet. And when I read the impact of meat production and the Western obsession with meat eating in our diet, I stopped eating meat. And, so those small things, if we all stop, if we all even reduced.
You stopped eating meat, but you also started writing poetry, right? Because at that time you were doing journalism.
I do think that things like that, just that one book could have an influence. And I know it influenced a whole generation of people. And, I've always believed in the power of the written word. And coming from Ireland, you just have to,
Right.
I mean, the written word, and particularly poetry, which, when I, in my ancestors' time, poetry was the great vehicle of hope. It was used as a political device. Encoded messages were placed into poetry and passed on. And those were, messages of rebellion against our oppressors. They were messages that included, my enemy intel, but most of all, those messages in poetry and song in Irish history are about hope. They were about telling people, we can do this.
Right.
We'll get through this. There will be a better time.
Can you tell us about that movement from being an environmental journalist to being a poet? Because at that time you were a journalist, and that was one way you told the truth of this.
True.
You were witnessing this. this
I have to
category?
say, I was censored more than I was published at that time. There were a lot of restrictions on what I was able to get out. And I think there are still forces at play which limit voice in mainstream publishing. But, luckily these days we have social media and other vehicles for getting messages out to you ask about how I ended up being a poet. My journey has been what you would call a portfolio career. So I've always been in publishing. So I've been a journalist and magazine editor and media communications director for 30 years, advising corporates and government. But all the while in the background, I've always been a creative writer, a poet, and, I do write personal essays as well. But it was really my mother's death 14 years ago that I guess caused it all to bubble to the surface. And I think I clung to poetry as a way of processing or even surviving the impact of, nursing my mother through a very, very, really horrific illness. It was pancreatic cancer. I think after her death, I really returned very strongly to poetry. And I found in it not just a lifeboat for me, but a connection to other people who had similar experiences, particularly as an immigrant. I found when I put my words out into the world, they were returned to me 1,000-fold in people's responses and in people sharing back their stories, which made both me and them reflect on our humanity and our shared human experience. And that to me is the greatest gift that poetry gives us, is our shared humanity. And I think it's also a voice in the world that transcends all of the politics of media and the economics and the commercial world, because poetry has never really been successfully commercialized or harnessed in that sense, in the way that, music and art are very subject to political forces and behind the scenes and financing. I think poetry has managed to remain outside of those influences as a voice. I mean, there may be some politics
involved. A wild plant that has not yet been domesticated.
Yeah. It hasn't. Yeah, I think that poets have a much freer hand in that sense, and maybe that's part of why I've ended up being a poet too. Like, I particularly love writing eco-poetry and knowing that will make its way into the world and hopefully impact people and help to make a change. Because I sort of feel like, the media use these stories to ramp up readership, and they sensationalize and in the end of the day, it's always yesterday's news, Whereas I think poems do carry on. They have a life after publication.
Yeah.
They tend to go on. And I've seen where my eco poems have been used in environment demonstrations and
right.
in art exhibitions.
Let's hear another poem. How about, may I suggest, because you were talking about movement and I mean, this poem Exiled, do you want to try that? And we can talk about,
yes, of
because
course.
we can talk about eco poetry, but I'm a little concerned if we talk too much about eco poetry, because I see you and hear you as a poet, and eco poetry I see as a subdivision, within this. Yeah. And I don't want to leave that impression that it's that you have an agenda, and that's what if you don't.
No. I mean, I write from the heart, and the eco poetry in there is actually driven partly as a journalist, but also very much as a mother. And, a mother questioning, what is it we're leaving behind for our children? Is this the sum total of who we are as a species, that we use and leave nothing for future generations? Really? this is happening on our watch. So as a human being, as a mother, and as someone looking to what we're leaving behind, it's almost a family issue for me,
Yes, yes,
It's
yes.
a question I think every parent should be asking themselves.
And there are poems throughout the book where you speak as a mother. I mean, you mentioned already the poems for your son that inspired
as a
that
mother
question.
and as a daughter, as a daughter observing change in my native west of Ireland, with my father and with my children. But there are other poems as well that have been prompted by COVID, because we've sustained some terrible losses in our family over the last year and a half.
Right.
So of course they crept into the book as well. I mean, it's as I said, poetry is bearing witness. And so, this is witness in our lives, but also in the greater world, because what impacts us are human issues, which impact so many people in the world.
Yeah, and I'm all with you. I mean, I think poetry does make something happen, and you do that in your poem. I mean, I'm quoting that deliberately, that old, often quoted line, "Poetry makes nothing happen," that Auden wrote. But you are changing it. You're turning it around, just as you do in the poem you read earlier.
So, a reversal of fortune for poetry. Right. I don't know if I think I've always thought that poetry can make things happen because of my heritage, because in Ireland poetry was such a lifeblood in the worst of times, and it's remained a fundamental part of the culture, as it is in many, many cultures, in the Middle East and in South America, and in your own culture, there are so many places in the world where poetry has been used to plant hope in the face of oppression.
Yeah,
and also it's witness, really, isn't it?
Right, and that planting hope. I mean, it's the light we cannot see. It's not the darkness we cannot see. That's the title of your book. I mean, it's the light, and there are a number of poems throughout, including this one, Exile, that where you play with light and
well, without further ado, then.
Okay, go ahead.
So this poem is dedicated to a very dear and very talented poet friend of mine, which will become clear when I read it.
All right.
Exiled, for Indran. We flew with the wind, sank our feet deep into foreign soil, drank thirstily from the poisoned springs of these mighty nations, worshipped at the false altar. As we look now across all the tumbled wreckage from your displaced shore to mine, might we wonder how we have come to this slow folding in to this abyss of our own creation, how we had failed to mother earth, suckled at the flaccid paps of mammon, feasted on the spoiled flesh of dying species, fleeced by specious prophecies, taken down now not by those great dreaded nuclear warheads, but by this microscopic Armageddon. Still, to be human is to persist, even at this infernal pass. We will stir the will to lean into the light.
Oh, it's magnificent, magnificent. Look, you do what Shakespeare does in King Lear when he says never, 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 but you do it with the phrase to this, to this, to this, to this, slow folding into this abyss. So there are the five to this, but then you use to this later again. It's just amazing.
I mean, I think that those to thises are a kind of a declaration of disbelief and trying to come to terms with where are we? I don't know about you, but I feel like the carpet's been pulled from under my feet. It's like this past year and a half in the world has just been incredibly dislocating, and fundamental change in how we live, and such uncertainty going forward. On top of that, you have climate change. Which,
right, but at the same time, you do finish with this affirming flame.
always,
I mean, this will
always,
to lean into
yeah,
the light, and
yeah, always.
that
Even
cheers.
the title poem of this collection also, that line, "the light we cannot see," comes from the last line in that poem, which I'm trying to locate so I can read you just the last line, which is, that one is a difficult poem because it was about nursing my mother through terminal illness.
Right.
But in the end of the day, what I'm saying is that I found love carried me out of that darkness. I could read you the
last part, page 78, I think.
Yeah. So I go, "Stirring in obscurity, a trick of the dark, or words inscribed in an ancient circle. What makes the righteous-minded believe they have the one true answer, when they never care to hear the question? I wake to the shining faces of my two blindfolded sons, lifting me out of the semi-gloom, bearing me towards a waiting form, the only one to have ever known all of me and love me nonetheless. And away with us into the light we cannot yet see, but know lies ahead."
Yeah.
So that's it to me. That's who we are. That's who we are as a species. Even in the darkest times, we strive to find the light.
Just a few observations. One, you read pitch perfect, and pauses and allowing every word to have its day, and that's good. That's great. And I think we can learn from listening to the way you read your poems, and we will and do. Another point, you use, and you have to learn this. I mean, the book has to be held in the hand to see it. I hope lots of readers get the book and look at what you do with space, and spacing throughout the book, and many of the poems, including this one. I mean, just for example, that very last line, "we cannot yet see," and then there's this sort of white space there, and then "but no," and then another extra space lies ahead. But you do, so you can show that how that looks. But there are poems in here. For example, if you turn to page, like "Either Way the Fact Remains," or let's say "Watching and Waiting" on 62. I mean, look at the way this looks on the page.
Yeah.
I mean, it's presented as a scroll almost up and down.
Yeah.
And you read it vertically, and the rest of the book you read, I mean, you read it in a different way. So it's a bold experimental book.
In some ways.
Yeah.
So some parts of that are because I particularly wanted to have long lines without a wraparound, without it running on to the next line. And so, for example, "Let's See" is one of those. And
Right.
Some of those have particular, they have an undulation to the form that's reflective of that sea. And the white spaces are really about the breath. They're about having the breath in the poem so that when you're reading it, you're guided by that. There's another poem which is quite, more on the experimental side as well. It's that one, "1 Minute to Midnight." And in that, you can see I've actually broken down the text.
Right.
And that's because it's about the erosion of the planet. And so in breaking down the text, I'm showing the gradual breakdown of Earth and what we're doing. And also, if you look at some of the word fragments, they have particular meaning themselves. So like there's a lot of O's, which are like a howl or of pain or an exclamation. And there's the word "comes" is broken up into CO, carbon monoxide, which is a big issue for us, and ME, me, because if we all reflect, we're responsible for it. So there's a lot of hidden messages if you look at why I've laid out particular poems. So I'm not being experimental or difficult for the sake of it. There's always a reason. There's another poem here, which is inspired by the children's book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And it's about basically, I guess, running away from the situation in the world and entering a cocoon.
I'm looking for a poem. There's another poem. Yeah. And there's another poem which I was chatting about your book with Sarah Cahill-Marin, with whom I edit Beltway, and she saw the double helix on the page, you know. And
oh, is that this one?
Must be, yes.
That's Season of Bridget.
Yeah.
I can tell you about that, actually. So that poem, when we were going through the catastrophic bushfires last year, right before COVID, we had 6 months of really catastrophic bushfires. They killed, you know, millions of animals, and millions of hectares of land got burned, and native forests. And I had been invited to be part of a group called the Prank Queens, who are this wonderful, amazing group of very talented women with an Irish connection who live in Australia. And we were putting on a cultural show that was funded by the Irish Consulate. And there was a whole series of these shows, but they were in honor of Bridget, who's the Irish, she was adopted by the Christian faith, but she was actually an ancient pagan goddess of poetry, earth, and fire. And so for this show, I thought, I'm going to summon Bridget. I'm going to write an incantation to her to come to our aid. And that's part of my culture, in that I grew up, and every springtime we used to pray to Bridget to bring, you know, us blessings for the year, to bless the wells and bless the land, because she was the patron, you know, the saint of earth. And we used to make these crosses to her in the shape of an X, which we would hang. You would hang them from doorways as a blessing, and from wells, to summon her, to bring a blessing to the water, etc. But you know, in my childhood, we'd go out into the fields and collect rushes, which are like grass, and we'd weave these. I was not very good at making these crosses. Mine were very, very odd shaped, but I managed to weave the crosses in the poem. And I think if you're writing an incantation to a pagan goddess, you should be using every, you know, tool in your armory to summon her. So I thought I'll weave in the crosses, and I actually feel it brings a potency to that poem. There are notes at the back of the book which explain this, so that if you're not aware of the tradition, you can learn. And I think that sort of brings an extra potency to the call to her. And the funniest part, or the weirdest part of this, is that on our final show, we were in a museum in North Sydney, and I was on stage summoning Bridget, and there was smoke. It was a really hot evening. The weather was hot and muggy, and all the smoke, we'd been living in smoke for 5 months, 6 months. And, you know, it was toxic. You couldn't go outside without a mask on. We were stuck inside a lot, but it was so hot and humid. We'd had to open the windows, and the smoke was coming in the windows. And as I did this incantation in our final show, there was this almighty crack in the sky above our heads, and the heavens opened.
Oh my God.
It poured, so much so that a week later we had floods. And actually, the Minister for Bushfire Recovery was transferred to the floods recovery portfolio. So that's how many floods we got. So by the end of several weeks, I was getting texts to write a rebuttal to get rid of her, because we'd had enough rain. That's only an anecdote now. I'm not saying it happened because of my incantation, but it was.
But one never knows. One never knows. Bridget may have answered.
One never knows. We have to keep the faith.
That's right.
And actually that poem as well, another lovely connection is that a dear childhood friend of mine from the west of Ireland has just recorded it. He's an actor and performance artist, Davo Grin. So he's just recorded that with the bodhrán, which is a traditional drum from Ireland, which is made from goat skin, and you beat it with a wooden stick. So it's a beautiful rendition of the poem. I'm so thrilled with it. So that's just been published by Rochford Street Press in Australia.
Wonderful. Tell us about being an Irish poet in Australia, and how long you've been away, and does it, what does it mean for your writing? For the question, to whom do you belong?
Oh goodness, aren't those the existential questions of an immigrant, if ever there were? It's a question I ponder from time to time. So I grew up in the west of Ireland. It's the most beautiful place on earth, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll argue with anyone who argues otherwise. And I came here in my mid-20s. So I've been here for about 27 years. So I've actually been here in Australia for longer than I lived in Ireland. But I'm fundamentally Irish. I mean, you can hear it. You can hear it in my speaking voice, but I think more strongly you can hear it in my written voice, in my personal essays, but also in my poetry very strongly. It's very lyrical. I think you will find there are word and other patterns in that poetry that you would find in other Irish poetry. And that is not deliberate. That is how it comes out. And I think that that's because that's how I learned, as a child. Poetry was everywhere. From the moment I was born, my dad was reciting poetry to me. And it was everywhere in our world. The pub is a bit of a social center in small towns in Ireland, especially rural towns. Well, it is everywhere. I mean, big cities as well. But it was a place where people in the community gathered, and people gathered in homes also, and you'd have this thing called rounds. And it's not about a round of drinks, it's about a round of sharing. So one person might play the tin whistle, another person might play the fiddle, someone might sing a song, someone would tell a story, someone would recite a poem. And so poetry was always there. It was part of the voice of the community. And I think that's where my poet voice came from, was from the growing up. And so it's not something I choose to, change. I don't know that I can change it. I think even in my experimental poems, you'll find that same lyrical voice. It's just that I've laid it out differently on the page because I have some other purpose in doing that. I never do, when you've observed about how the form of the poem on the page, really, if that happens, it's always for a purpose. I'm not making things hard to read or, playing with them without a reason behind it. Having said that, there are other aspects of my work, like the imagery and lyricism, which come about, and also some wordplay, which come about in a very natural way. They just seemed, and I think that's part of who I am as a person. I have this, humor in me, which comes out in wordplay as well. And so you will find all of that in the poems too. And fundamentally, there's a huge core of storytelling, which you can't miss in any of my 3 books. Right. But there's really a huge amount of narrative in the book. So you can pick them up and have an almost flash fiction experience with them if you want to, but it's not fiction. It's memoir. It's witness. You know, it's life for us and community.
I would love to ask you, there's some interference, some sound in the background. I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. I hope you can hear me all right.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you to sort of give us a little bit of a feast, maybe pick 3 poems and just and give us a little bit of a mini reading. And I have some favorites that I mean points that, just because we talked about it earlier, like out of the mouths of babes, for example, or Where Gulls Cry. But I mean, I'll leave it to you to pick. You know, this is your 3rd book. Why don't you read 3 poems now? And we'll keep that.
Okay.
That
well, so constitutional.
Okay.
In terms of storytelling, I think is probably a good one to give you a fix for when this book was written.
Good.
So I might start with that one. Constitutional. Together in isolation, tugged by a small eager dog who has waited all day, we step out into the chill, spearing off a contracting Antarctic, our silence implicit, uncomplicated by unfamiliarity, winding through the familiar neighborhood of our marriage, a murder of sorrows, arrows out of evening branches, scatters into cobalt overhanging saffron, screeches of late homing lorikeet, lights blinking on across old stone ramparts, thrusting up from the eclipsed reserve. Sure as taxes, death stalks us as we turn for home, past the tumble-down wall that speaks of grander days, conspiring in our silence, resisting the urge to hurdle all the closed borders between us and all we left behind, cocooned half the earth away, arms that had raised us, embracing empty air and this complicated new unfamiliarity, silence swallowing the unfathomable prospect. They may not survive the long wait until we are able to return. And another poem that really reflects the current time in our world is, or in my world, is Where Gulls Cry. It's the voice of an immigrant far from home. You know, we've been unable to get back to see our family for over 2 years now, and it looks like it might be 3 because the Australian borders have been closed. So this poem speaks of the beauty and the hankering for my native west of Ireland. Where gulls cry, I could tell you how the whole earth seems to end at this one place where the land falls cleanly into a tumultuous thundering, the relentless roar of furious millennia crashing iced cobalt against 300 million years of vertical bituminous siltstone stubbornness, all overlaid with a violence of vivid greenness, inconceivable until witnessed, where the sky splits open above, brewing colliginous charcoal, yielding to an inevitability of iridescence, streaming shards, spearing, simmering, drizzle-laden mists, all lit as if from within, with an otherworldly luminosity, approximating divinity, a scene so sharp yet ethereal, surreal, imprinted in a part of self within but a part that might burst from this pulsing bone suit, this shadow world flesh mantle, sheerly in the act of reliving that reminiscence. I could tell you all of that, or I could say how much this exiled soul aches for home.
Beautiful.
So that was two. I was going to read you suggestions for living, but I'd like to finish with that. So do you want to finish with that now, or?
No, let's hold on. And why don't you read a, well, look, it's up, obviously, the book is a rich, it's a movable feast, you know, of a book, so there are many poems you can pick.
Well, there's a very hopeful poem which I wrote for a very dear friend, Carolyn, because we are also separated across the world due to COVID and the current circumstances, and it's hope for the world. So, and it's a very lyrical piece. I could read you that if you like.
Yes, yes.
A song for all the lost days, for Carolyn. When all the earth is slipping under nestling covers of never knowing, in the ever sleep shadow of this half-waking dreaming time, I will gather the last sprigs of lavender from a raven-feathered sunset and step into the nothing nowhere vastness void between. I will carry a bundle of berries from the soaring flowering loricacia, a fragrant spray of your adored cilantro, a cluster of red bell peppers bright as blood spurts, a clutch of smoke-infused chipotle full of fire, a parcel of limes from the wild prickly ash fagara, and to keep the ghouls at bay, a carafe of ale mulled from elderberry blends. I will find you where the tides of always and unending drift into the coast of ever-spanning time. By the feet of your beloved giant sequoia, we'll lay out a feast for all the waking, sleeping souls. Together we'll unfold a muslin full of white columbine, and walking to the edge of your great ocean, we'll unwrap all the light that we can hold, leaning in to lift each tender petal and set it off to swirl upon the waves of every shore.
Therein lies the light again and again.
Yes.
It suffuses the whole book, you know, it goes through and it's not to be cliched, but it illuminates. It's an illuminated book, literally.
Maybe we could call it an incantation to people to come to the light, you know. I think if anything, that would be my hope for it.
And a song for all the lost days. No matter how much is lost in a day, the song comes to the rescue. You know, you can find it. So, invoke
absolutely.
That. Tell me a little bit about your sort of a standard question for a poet. I mean, who formed you as a poet? Who are the poets you read in particular that you celebrate and you go back to when you have time to read, you know, besides?
Well, I mean, I read a poem every single day, always. And I have bookshelves full of books. But I grew up with poetry as spoken word. You know, it was poems by anonymous poets and poets of my community, and poems that my dad had learned from, you know, at school, which he recited. I mean, he recited Shakespeare, Keats, Shelley, you know, I mean, there's so many of the classics, as well as, you know, more local, colloquial type poetry. And I remember, I mean, all of those went in and influenced me, but I remember having an epiphany, like a real earth-shaking moment at the age of 12, when I read Emily Dickinson for the first time. And the first poem I read was Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me. And I had lost some people close to me. And you know, being from a small community, there was always death in the community, but there was always also a belief in our community that there was something beyond death and that the dead never left us. And I know people find that creepy, but for me, that's never been a creepy thing. You know, it's always been how I feel, that this world is a little liminal. We stand on the doorstep of something else. And I particularly have to believe that, having lost people I love. They're not lost to me. They're always with me. And even if, you know, my rational mind says they're gone, they're gone, they're gone, inside my heart is saying they're here, they're here. They'll always be here. And that was the gift that Emily Dickinson gave me at the age of 11, was this, you know, human connection, that someone who lived and died long before I was born, and, you know, gave me the sense that someone else understood and believed the same thing I did. You know, this connection to this other world. And I love her still. I absolutely love Emily Dickinson. So she, I would say, absolutely is a force and an influence and a love, you know. But also, of course, Evan Boland, who we sadly lost last year, and Seamus Heaney. You know, there's some just profoundly extraordinary poems that they wrote that still, you know, influenced me, and that I actually, a good friend, Nat O'Reilly, who's an Australian poet living in America, I was reading an interview with him yesterday, and he pinged two of my favorite lines from a couple of Heaney's poems, and then, funnily enough, he when he read this book and very kindly wrote a lovely comment on it, he said that the quote from Yeats in here was one of his favorites. So that was nice. Yeats is definitely as well, you know, in there in terms of the lyricism and the liminality. I really like that. And the narrative aspects of his work. So yeah, those are definite influences and people I love to read.
And what about the larger community of poets? Is it a community of poets, or is it a community of egos? See, no, I'm just joking. But I mean, is it? I'm thinking of the collective poetry, you know, poetry written being shared now through Zoom and the internet so easily from all points of the world. Can you sort of comment about the state of things? You know,
yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the arts globally have suffered greatly during COVID, and I think it's, you know, been a really wonderful aspect of it that poetry has been able to survive and reach out. Certainly, you know, in Australia, and particularly in Sydney, where I live, we've got lots of great venues where poetry is available. You can go and listen to live poetry pretty much any day of the week. We're really blessed to have them, to have some great organizations who support poetry here. And I know Ireland is the same. And I see, you know, the UK and US have got those things happening as well. So, you know, when all of those venues shut down, it's been wonderful to see, because of COVID, obviously, it's been wonderful to see that there's been a striving to keep poetry in the community and to keep people connected through poetry. So, you know, it is one of the great gifts of the internet and you know, all of the different channels and apps that we have, that we can continue to connect through poetry. But I think actually one, you know, almost side effect of that, which has been an unexpected blessing, is that a lot of these venues, which were very local have been able to tap into international poets now. And so you and I having this conversation wouldn't have happened a year and a half ago, because we wouldn't have thought to do it online. You know, we would have been waiting to read together at a venue where we could geographically, you know, meet, as we did last year.
Right.
But yeah, so I think that's been a really lovely aspect of it, has been the internationalization of poetry gatherings. And, you know, any, you know, anthology launches or whatever that I'm in, you know, in recent times, it's been really lovely to see that there's been people from the US and the UK and New Zealand who've all dropped in, and who wouldn't have been able to do that, obviously.
That's right.
Previously, because they would have been live in-person events. Although I do absolutely miss the live in-person events. I think there's nothing like being in a room and listening to poetry or reading poetry and hearing people respond to it.
Yeah, no,
The
I miss
ripple,
it. I miss it too.
yeah, the
And
ripple that goes through a room, you know, when a line that's so profound and impactful is read, is part, I feel, of that experience of sharing poetry that I really do miss.
And hope with luck, we'll be able to slowly recover that, those live performances. At least I'm hoping to restart the series that I do live in a local restaurant at the end of August. You know, there's so much to talk about, and I don't want to overstay this occasion. I hope you'll come back on the show at another time, and we'll talk about other aspects of your poetry and the art. I know you would like, and I think I would love you to read the poem Suggestions for Living, and you could perhaps mention the little bit about what a cento is and the reason, and the fact that, you know, I mean, this poem, well, the roots of the poem and the origin of the poem and so on. So I'll let you speak to that. Go ahead.
Thank you. So this poem is really special to me. It's a tribute to Jessie Lendenny, who's an amazing woman. She's recently been recognized by the President of Ireland for her contribution to literature in Ireland over the past 40 years. So Jessie is managing director of Salmon Poetry, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. And Jessie has been such an amazing proponent of marginalized voices for the past 40 years. She was way ahead of her time in doing that. You know, working class voices, and particularly women poets as well. And a few rebels, you know. There has to be a few.
Including
and she's a bit of a rebel herself, and we all absolutely love her for that. So this is to and for Jessie, but also it's a celebration of her work. So it's a cento, and a cento, as you know, is a poem that's constructed of lines from other poems. So this poem is constructed from lines from Jessie's 2 books, and they were kind of my favorite lines from all of her poems, and I've woven them together to make a new story, which is that this is a celebration of Jessie's wisdom. You know, that this is the wisdom of a life well and truly beautifully lived. And it's also a life lived in the west of Ireland, 10 minutes from my home. So it describes places from my childhood and places I dream of and absolutely love. So that's what's in this poem too. So it's very much a weaving together of Jessie and my love of that place. So here we go. Suggestions for Living a Cento after Jessie Lendenny. Lay still, the sounds heard, the beginnings of comfort. Feel the sea on the wind, the falling of the wave riding the horizon, and the waves recede beyond the cliffs, beyond the trees, rows upon rows, filling their long trailing sacks. In the darkness, the silence at the center of the wind, the sound of rain. In the dark, trace a circle around the willow. Time the slowest of movements. Fine rain against thin glass, against hard stones, like so many broken children. Grow into gypsy, hobo, a child of rain. No water as it seeps from sky, from the heart. Know the sharp light of sun on bottles broken in the street. The horizon is both this path and the edge of the sea. And memory is a fracturing, a breaking of light and dark, with an old dog who knows all the secret places, down the unpaved road to the calm bay. Become part of something sacred, salmon in a small stream that rolled down to the beach, going home or starting out. Believe in past lives. Sit and wait for everyone to come home. Silver dogs in the sea unhindered, gazing down the valley to Liscannor, Lahinch and the bay. Walk the stones of Clahan. Romantic Ireland smells of soft wind. Move slowly among ghosts whose bodies are anywhere but here. Lose place, follow another pack. Maybe take a wrong turn at the edge of the sea as the last storm leaves again. Lay still, the night moved past. Brush wonder as a child, fingers tapping at windows. Reach out, softly moved.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for that beautiful poem, all these beautiful poems. The Light We Cannot See, which has been published by Salmon Press and is available everywhere, where ask for it at your bookstore, local bookstore, and or order it online. And I hope we'll be able to do this again soon and meet also again in person.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this, but also for the gift of all you do for poetry in the world. You have so many extensions of your work in poetry. So thank you so much for that. No. It's a gift, it really is.
I'm really excited to have you on this particular program, Talking with Poets. It began as Speaking with Poets, and somewhere along the line it became Talking with Poets, but I think either title would work. I'll post it on the channel and I'll send it to you, and hopefully we'll keep this moving, and good work. Well done. Congratulations on this lovely book. And I'm looking forward to your next one. I know there's another book about to come out, so looking forward to that as well. All the very best to you. Much love.
Thank you so much, Indran. You too.
From the world. Thanks. Cheers. Have a good evening. Yeah.